What's up, everyone? Today we're going to be going over the barbell bench press and just why it might not be as good as a movement as you think for muscle growth. And we're going to go over the pros and the cons and how you can kind of visualize some of these principles and laws of physics and biomechanics. My goal of this video is not to demonize the barbell bench press. It's a movement that would definitely work for growing muscle. And my goal of this video is just to let you know the flaws of it as well as the benefits, and for you to decide whether or not you want to keep it in your programming routine, however you set up your workouts. But yeah, so let's just get into the video. First thing we're going to get into is the pros of the barbell bench press, and then we'll kind of go over the negatives towards the end. So the first thing is that the humerus becomes perpendicular during the movement. It becomes perpendicular to gravity. So the reason why this is important is because whenever we want to load a muscle, we have to get its primary lever perpendicular with gravity, or its line of resistance. In this case, our line of resistance is gravity, and our primary lever is the humerus. So during the movement, as you can see right here, the humerus, I mean, he's in the middle of his movement, but the humerus would eventually become perpendicular, and depending on the range of motion of the individual, it might even come down here, which is okay. It doesn't need to. I do it personally because it feels better for me than stopping halfway through the movement or 75% through the movement. But yeah, so getting that humerus, which is the upper arm, perpendicular with gravity is super important for loading the chest muscle, because that is the only way to properly load the chest muscle, is to get that humerus closer to gravity, or perpendicular with gravity. Alright, so next let's look at opposite position loading. So opposite position loading applies to every single exercise you'll ever do. It's a principle of physics, and it's the only way a muscle can, a muscle is being properly loaded. Not the only, it's one of the ways. But yeah, so all opposite position loading is basically, if you had, say, a truck, right? And you attach a rope to that truck, the best way to pull that truck would, of course, be to pull directly opposite of that truck. For example, you wouldn't have a truck and pull from a 45-degree angle, because that's just, you're not gonna most effectively move that truck, because you're at an angle that's not opposite to the load. And that's the same thing for any exercise. In order to have a maximal and optimal amount of load onto a muscle, you have to have the load be coming from opposite of that muscle, or your body, depending on where the position you're in. So in a barbell bench press, kind of a hard angle to see, but we know that this bar right here is directly opposite of the chest, which is down here. We know this because if you've ever barbell bench pressed, you know that it's directly opposite from you. So that's a super important thing, and it's very good that the barbell bench press does that, because it's a big thing in physics, and it applies to every single lift that you'll do, any single exercise, all that. Okay, now let's talk about its neutral secondary lever. So as we talked about earlier, the primary lever, that is what needs to become perpendicular to your line of resistance, and that is what's most important, is that we're getting that there. But another thing to account for, and this applies to most muscles but not all muscles, well, it applies, but you just don't have to concern yourself. For example, if you're doing a bicep curl, the secondary lever would be your wrist, and the flexion or extension of your wrist. And while it would play a role in the load going onto your bicep, it's not per se gonna diminish your load to where it's super important. So next, let's look at the secondary lever. So the secondary lever is always going to be your forearms or your lower arm, however you want to call it. The bones are the humerus and the radius. But yeah, so it's this muscle right here, and it's super important that we get that muscle, that we keep that muscle straight vertical. So we want to keep that muscle parallel with our line of resistance, because it ensures that no extra load or less load is being applied to our pectorals. So, for example, if we were doing a close grip bench press, let's just say that, this forearm, because our hand placement would be here, this forearm would come in this direction, meaning that we are now involving a function of another muscle, and that other muscle is the, and that other muscle is the tricep, because the tricep participates in elbow extension. That because the tricep participates in elbow extension, the muscle bringing in your arm closer is going to be using that function. And it's important because that takes load off the chest, right? So let me open this up a bit, get some better lighting. So whenever we're doing a movement, we want to make sure the secondary lever stays neutral or parallel with our line of resistance. Okay, so on the other hand, if we were doing, for example, a dumbbell chest fly, right? The reason why a lot of people aren't doing the exact same weight when they bench opposed to a chest fly is because now, instead of having your lever neutral like this, you're bringing the lever out, right? Okay, so when you're like that, when your lever's like that, that is loading the chest more because you are increasing the lever's length. So, for example, if you had a crowbar, right, and you had a crowbar and you were trying to wedge a car tire up, right? So if you had a very short crowbar, you would need a lot more strength and a lot more force to be able to lift that car. But for example, if you had a much longer one, you wouldn't need as much force because you wouldn't have to apply as much force to get the same amount of torque. And that's the same thing applies to lifting. And so you're going to have to create a lot more force if you have. So you're going to have to create a lot more force if your arm is out while doing like a fly, meaning that your muscle can't actually use as much weight, even though it's producing the same amount of force, if not more. Yeah, so next thing we got, let's talk about stability. So an important aspect of all exercises is you want stability, not only for safety, but in order to preserve energy and make sure that we're loading that muscle as efficiently as possible. So this one's kind of simple, but it can vary depending on the bench. So if you had a narrow bench, for instance, and your bench was per se like only that much area right there, you would have a rough time balancing because your lats and your shoulder blades would be coming off the bench, so it would just be harder. But in most cases, a bench is more than wide enough to have good stability. So yeah, you don't gotta worry about that too much, but in general, the bench press does have a very good stability factor. Not perfect always, but it's a good stability factor. So I wouldn't stress about it too much. Okay, next thing, let's talk about the strength curve, right? So for any muscle, the strength curve is always going to be a muscle is strongest when it's lengthened and weakest when it's contracted. And that means that in a lengthened position, a muscle can output more force than when it's shortened. So the bench press and most exercises that deal with gravity, they have a good strength curve. So let's see. So right here, right? So right here at the bottom of our movement, the humerus would be right there. And so that's when the weight would be the heaviest, when our muscles are the strongest, because the chest is fully stretched at that point. And as we go up, the pec starts to contract and makes it so that the movement is also easier. So as we go up, it's weaker, the muscle is weaker, but the load is becoming lessened because those levers that we talked about earlier are becoming neutral to gravity. And any lever that's neutral there's no force, no weight applied to it. Meaning, think of a grandfather clock, right? So when you're in a grandfather clock, when you have a grandfather clock and you look at it, the metronome at the bottom is vertical to gravity, is parallel to gravity, and that metronome will hang there forever. There's no load being placed on it. But as soon as you move that metronome, there's a force acting upon it now, gravity. So if you were to let go of the metronome, it wouldn't be able to stay in the same spot. It would have to swing to the other side. And that's just showing that there's a force being placed upon it, and there's a load onto it. All right. So that's it for the pros. I mean, not bad, but not good. It does some of the main things that we talk about, but you'll see very soon that the cons kind of outweigh the pros, in my opinion. And you'll see why in a second. So the first con, right? We have bilateral deficit. So bilateral deficit is a principle of lifting where basically, let's go into how a muscle contracts and how the signal is sent. So basically, when you want to move a muscle, there's a signal sent to the brain, and it fires through nerve synapses, and it tells that that muscle that, hey, I'm ready to contract, let's contract. And this is all done in a matter of split seconds. Every single movement you do, every single finger, your brain is sending a signal because it has to. Okay? So same thing obviously happens when you do a bench press. So bilateral deficit just means that when we're moving something like a barbell, which is a single object, right? It's an object that cannot be bent. It's an object that cannot be split in half. It's a one single object, right? But as you can see, it's being moved by two separate levers, moment arms, however you want to describe it. But it's being moved by two separate things, two separate arms, right? So instead of the brain being able to only focus on telling that muscle to contract and having as much force output as it can, it has to kind of take away some of that force output, and it has to basically send a signal that says, hey, this is one thing, it can tip over pretty well, so we need to also focus on balancing this, and in turn that makes the muscle unable to produce as much force. So how do we fix this? Well, there's not really a way to fix it for the bench press, but in, for example, a dumbbell press, you'd have two arms and you'd also have two weights, so two objects that you're moving, and they're not connected, they are completely separate, so you'd still be able to load the pecs in the same way as a barbell bench press, but you wouldn't have bilateral deficit. So even though the weight looks a lot less because you're not moving, let's say you you're bench pressing 225, right? You might only be able to bench 70 pounds, right, for the same amount of sets and reps. And you might think, hey, that's only 140 pounds versus 225, so I must be loading the pecs more. Well, that's not the case, because when you have things like levers and you have things like bilateral deficit, you can you start to learn that just because a weight is more doesn't mean that that same load is being placed onto the muscle, and it doesn't mean the muscle has to work as hard. So yeah, that's bilateral deficit, and that's why you're actually not as strong as you think. You're not at your fullest potential when you're bench pressing. Okay. So let's go to the humerus again. So the humerus in a bench press, because you're moving one object, like we just talked about, the humerus cannot move freely. Meaning, at the top of your movement, so let's look at this diagram, right? You can see that this person, his arms are fully locked out. He cannot move any more than that, and that is because the bar is restricting where his arms can move, because they're in a fixed position on the bar, right? So let's talk about a little bit about the range of motion, and we'll get to that in the next one too. But they kind of tie hand in hand. So the range of motion in a bench press is cut short in both. Well, not so much the lower part of the movement, mainly the top portion, because even with a barbell, most people can get it here unless you have a massive chest and for some reason it starts up here or you have short arms, which is possible, but it's not usually the case. So on the bottom portion, you usually get a good range of motion, right? You can get your humerus perpendicular with gravity, which is what we want. But at the top half of the motion, you're cutting it short. So the job of the humerus, its primary function is the job of the pec, the job of the pec is to pull the humerus closer to the midline of the body. And the pec does a very good job of this, and it can get the humerus all the way to about there, right? But as you can see, in the bench press, because you have a fixed bar, this humerus is only getting about there. So you're cutting a large portion of the range of motion you're cutting about 30%, roughly. It depends on your arm length and things like that, and where your hands are on the bar especially. But you're cutting 30% of the load to your pectoral muscle, and that's a lot of load. And mind you, yeah, you still have 70% of your load going out to the pec, which is good. It's a solid number, but studies show that you need about at least 80% range of motion to get the full benefit in muscular hypertrophy. So you are diminishing how fast and how much muscle you can grow by using the barbell bench press and not letting that humerus get to where it can fully go. So yeah, that's a big thing. And so yeah, the next con was just it lacks range of motion. We just talked about how it lacks range of motion. So those two kind of went hand in hand. So now let's talk about something that's really not thought about, and it's a super important factor. So like we talked about gravity being a force, right? Gravity is a force that is always it's always happening, so you have to always consider it when you're lifting. But another invisible force that most people don't think about or don't consider is friction force. So friction force just states that when you are walking, when you're sitting, you are creating force, right? And you don't really realize it because it's not a force that was taught a lot in school, and it's not something that you can see, so you don't recognize it. But I want you to take this little example and understand this. So let's use a wall sit, for example. So during a wall sit, we know it's isometric, right? And like we talked about, you could okay, let's talk about how if you stood straight, right? So if you're standing straight up, you are neutral to gravity, and although you would get tired just for more so energy purposes, in theory you could stand there indefinitely. You wouldn't like if humans didn't have to eat, you could stand there for a very long time and have no problem with it. But in general, you could, if I told you, here's $50, stand in place for 3 hours, you could do it, no problem. But if I told you, okay, hold a wall sit for 3 hours, you'd be like, no, there's no chance, I can't do it. But they're both isometrics, right? You're both just, you're not moving, there's no dynamic aspect of it. So why would I have to, why can I do one but not the other? Well, this is where friction force comes into play. Although your muscle isn't going through a dynamic movement, it's isometric, so yes, the muscles are working, but the reason why the quad becomes so fatigued is because it's actually having a force more than gravity placed on it. Meaning, if I were to put oil or just something slippery under your feet would slide away from you. So, because there's no oil and because there's not that, your foot is set into the ground, it's not going anywhere, but that force is still being applied. So there's still friction, and friction creates load onto the muscle. So that's why a muscle fatigues extremely fast in something like a wall sit. So now let's go over how that applies to the bench press. Well, the same thing applies. I have friction going in the direction of both of these hands. So friction, if I put oil on this bar, the hands would slide outward in both directions. And that's because you're pushing outward, right? Because that is the way that you're applying force to the bar. You're not pulling the bar in because the bar can't bend, so you have to push it outward. And that's the opposite of the way the humerus wants to go. So that's another reason why the barbell bench press is flawed, is that the humerus wants to move this way, but your hands and secondary lever have friction force going in the opposite direction. So it's counterintuitive. It's counteractive to each other. So yeah, a big no-no. We don't want friction force playing a negative role in our exercises or movements. Okay, so let's look at the non-neutral lever. So back to the lever. Just how I said that. Excuse me. Just how I said that a lever can be, for the most part, it can be parallel with gravity, which is good. It can also be a negative depending on your hand position and people's bench press form. So, like, for example, this guy, he has a slightly angled humerus angle. So, right now, even though he should be at his most relaxed state, his most relaxed position, he should just be stabilizing this bar, he's still using force from his pecs to keep this bar up because they're still loaded. Now, if you had something like a dumbbell and you could get your humerus and your forearm completely vertical, right here there would be no loading on the chest. The chest would be able to relax a bit, and it would just have to use stabilization muscles like the triceps and the biceps to stabilize the weight. He wouldn't have to worry about it. But right now, there's still load going to his pec, meaning his pec is becoming unnecessarily fatigued, which is, sorry, I don't usually talk this much. But yeah, no, it's very important that you keep that lever neutral as much as possible and as long as possible throughout the movement. Okay. Just a couple more things, and they're fairly quick, but yeah. So the barbell bench press, the weight of the barbell causes spinal loadage because our spine is not in a necessarily safe position. Now, in general, a bench press is going to have less spinal loadage than, say, a deadlift or a squat that puts a lot of load on your spine. So it's not the worst thing, but it is there, so I just wanted to address it. Now this can be a good and a bad thing. So in the purpose of muscle building and say bodybuilding, if your goal is just to grow muscle, it's a factor that you don't want to place. You don't want to risk your overall health to grow some muscle in a movement that, as you see, is very flawed. Much more flaws than there are pros. So you don't want that, right? You don't want extra load on the spine if you don't have to. And yeah, so just having that large weight onto your spine causes a lot of issues in the long run. But this can be used in for benefit in players like in sports like rugby, football, high contact sports that need to be used to large loads placed onto the spine. So in that case, it's good. But we all know those sports come with a lot of risk of injury and things like that. But it's their profession, so you gotta do what you gotta do in their case. But when it comes to muscle building, you don't want extra load on the spine, like in a bench press or a squat or something like that. Lastly, this one's kind of like a simple one, but it's something that can be important depending on where you work out, how you work out. The need for a spotter, because you can't drop the weight like in a dumbbell press or a cable press. You need a spotter, and that can be an inconvenience, and people get injured a lot from it. Some people die. It's very extreme cases. I don't want you to think I'm reaching on that one. It's a possibility, but it's highly unlikely. But yeah, so the need for a spotter is something that people consider if you're working out alone at your house. It's just an extra safety risk that you don't really want to place. And I know you might feel macho doing it, but it's not worth having a couple 100 pounds fall on your neck or fall on your chest or tearing a pec or a tricep or a bicep because you can't get the weight off of you. So there's just something that is not needed, and yeah, I actually forgot to address something in the second con of why the humerus can't move freely. So this is super important. The shoulder joint, right? So the shoulder joint is Jesus. The shoulder joint is definitely something to consider. So because the humerus can't move freely, it has to apply pressure into something called the glenoid socket, or the glenoid cavity, however you want to call it. But it is applying a lot of force into this. And just to get a general impression of how much force it applies, if you were doing, for instance, 315 pound bench press, which is very, very heavy, and a lot of people won't even get to that in their lifetime, which is fine. But it's just an example, and you can obviously the amount of force would increase or decrease depending on how much weight you had. But in a 315 bench press, you have about 3,500 pounds of force being applied to that socket, when that socket is not meant to have a lot of force going into it. And yeah, so it's just way too much force for the shoulder joint to handle, and that's why a lot of people have shoulder injuries during the bench press, or they have shoulder injuries down their life because of the bench press. You are putting so much force into that socket, and it is just wearing and tearing and rubbing against cartilage in the socket, and you will 100% have some shoulder problems in the long run if you're benching big weight like that. But yeah, that's just something I forgot to mention. So yeah, I have them listed here, and I have about 5 pros to the bench press, and I have at least 7, and that's just the ones that I went over. There are other ones that we can get into at another time, but these are just the big ones. And yeah, so there's other things that are obvious, like the energy. For example, you know that when you bench press, you're going to have to use a lot more energy than if you dumbbell bench pressed. So yeah, just that in general and things like that where it's kind of obvious, but if you guys want me to go over that in another video, just let me know. But yeah, 100% is a pretty poor movement if you're looking at it from a hypertrophy standpoint and muscle growth. So yeah. With that being said, appreciate you guys watching the video. Leave a like and a comment if you'd like. Share it to someone that lifts, and just kind of spread some knowledge and let people know what's going on and how they can better their routine or keep their routine the same. It's up to them. Completely your decision. But let's all just lift and have fun and stay healthy. See you guys in the next one.